And yes, this conference will be recorded, and I do want to make a little announcement about that. If you're uncomfortable having your video on and you don't want that to be recorded, please shut your video off at this time. We will have an opportunity to do Q&A with videos on at the end, and we'll stop the recording at that point so that will not be saved, because all of our MWEE webinar videos are actually archived on the Bay Program's education YouTube page. So you should have that link in your email already, and I'll be sending that out after this webinar as well. But just really briefly, some other housekeeping items. If you can make sure to keep muted. We will have time for Q&A throughout the presentation. So if you have questions that come to you throughout, please throw those into the chat, and we'll be able to field those at various times during the presentation. Additionally, we have a couple of webinars coming up that we want to make sure you're aware of. Again, we do this on a monthly basis. So we have one on April 21st at 3:30 around empowering heritage, creating meaningful engagements to support resilience in changing landscapes, which I think is going to be excellent. And then one in May on the 19th around accessing and using data. And we'll be kind of diving into 3 different tools through Globe, Wiki Watershed, and the updated version of FieldScope. So some really exciting things. I also wanted to make a really quick plug for the Mid-Atlantic Climate Change Education Conference, which is now accepting proposals for sessions. Those are open until April 13th, and registration is also open, just $20 for the 3-day conference. So check that out at the website here, www.maccec.org. With that, we are really excited. Sorry about that. Anybody who's not muted right now, if you could just go ahead and mute. We're really excited to introduce our feature speaker for today. I should say speakers because it's really a partnership of folks that will be here with us, but I'm going to pass it off to Grace from Earthforce here in just a moment. They're going to be sharing with their partners about how they plan and implement civic action projects, especially maybe in this distance learning environment. We know that the civic action piece of the MWEE is sometimes one of the more challenging ones to access, and that's for a variety of reasons that they're going to share with us today. And these are going to be some really practical tools and ways to kind of get towards some of those policy-based actions that can come from meaningful watershed educational experiences. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grace.
Thanks so much, Elise. Yeah, my name is Grace Eddinger. I'm the Chief Program Officer at Earthforce, and we are a civic engagement, environmental education nonprofit. So we work with educators directly across the country, and also a slew of really great other organizations, nonprofits, government agencies to help them strengthen the action component of their programming already. And kind of with that, we work with a ton of BWET grantees in the Chesapeake Bay and in the Great Lakes, because this kind of civic component is really important in a MWEE, and we found that it's one of the pain points for many MWEE practitioners. So we've kind of taken a lot of our tools and tailored them to fit the MWEE scope, which is really great, and we've just been continuing our partnership with NOAA in that way. So we have 2 groups that we're going to be sharing with you today. The first is Alyssa McConkey, who is our Partnerships Program Manager, and she will be with Mary Helen at Pickering Creek. Our second is Justin Zacharin, who is our Colorado Program Manager, and he is joined by a team of educators he works with directly. So we have a partner organization, a MWEE practitioner, as well as educators, formal K-12 educators that are going to be speaking with you today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Grace. And thank you all for being here today. I am super pleased to welcome and introduce Mary Helen Gellen, Education Manager with Pickering Creek Audubon Center. Mary Helen, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Yeah, so I'm so happy to be here with you all today. My name's Mary Helen from Pickering Creek Audubon Center. And I wanted to share a little bit about how we have brought civic engagement into the MWEE programs that we've been working with, especially over the last, I would say, year and a half or so, and through our COVID challenges. So All of what I'm going to share today is, a work in progress. So we are learning alongside everybody else as we figure out ways to best implement action projects and to best encourage that civic action component for students. So just a quick background about our organization. We are a 400-acre wildlife refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland. And we focus primarily on working with students pre-K all the way up through high school. So that is in 4 Eastern Shore counties. We have 2 active Meaningful Watershed education experiences going on right now. And so actually, Grace, you can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about both of these programs. We have a Wicomico County 6th grade science program, and in Caroline County, we have a high school program in the environmental earth science class. And that is taken by students that are in 9th or 10th grade. So it's a combination of students in that grade. Both of these programs are following similar tracks, but they are a little bit different. But I'll kind of go back and forth a little bit and talk about some of the aspects of each program. These students are focused primarily on the impact of human actions on wildlife or on habitat health. So both of our student groups are kind of doing some initial investigation into wildlife or habitat health around their local communities, and then they're planning on taking action in different ways. Go ahead, Grace, to the next slide. All right, so this all starts, of course, with teacher training. So I want to share a little bit about how we got involved with Earth Force, and Elise, back maybe a year and a half ago, introduced me to Grace and to Alyssa. And so our education team went and got a little bit of Earth Force training, and we brought that training to our teachers. And so at the beginning of the school year of 2019-2020 school year, we began introducing the Earth Force process into the existing MWEEs that we had developed. And so the teachers began to introduce these criteria-based decision-making tools, the stakeholder engagement, stakeholder empathy mapping, all of that into their programming last year. And of course, last year, our students went through this process. They started to come up with these fantastic plans for action, and everything changed right at the time when we were about to go ahead and start to actually implement that action. So we did, over the course of last year, we made some adjustments so that students could carry out action at home last spring. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then about how we've adapted the student program to take place this year. But I do want to go back and say, with teachers, we spent some time training last summer and the summer before. But last summer we had a dedicated day where we focused on building process knowledge for the teachers on the environmental policies and action projects. So Grace, you can go ahead and hit to the next one. So we had some great guest speakers come in. We had Vince Meldrum, the CEO of Earth Force, who I believe is here today, and then also Mary Breslin, a 7th grade teacher in Virginia, who has been working with Earth Force for a long time. And so this was really fantastic. It gave our teachers a chance to kind of hear about that civic action process and hear about how you can implement it in the classroom in a way that's manageable for where you're at with the project. So that was a really fantastic introduction, and go ahead and hit it again. We also brought in some elected officials. So we had Denton Town Council member Doncello Wilson and Wicomico County Council member Josh Hastings. So these elected officials came in, they shared about their interest in environmental issues within their municipalities. And then they also spent some time talking about how students might be able to access them in their offices as they're thinking about action projects in the coming years. You can go ahead, Grace. So what we did after that wonderful training was we took a look at some of the lessons that we wanted to engage students in the coming year. Of course, we didn't know what school was going to look like, but we ended up creating some student journals that are in the format of Google Slides that teachers began teaching either as assignments that students would work on asynchronously but more often we found that that was a challenge. So they started to teach these lessons synchronously. And so those lessons included things like figuring out the differences between policies and practice. Grace, you can hit ahead. And why those policies and practices matter. And then one more time. And then they do sort of a sorting activity as an introduction. So how can they know the difference between what is a rule or a policy and a practice? And one thing that the teachers commented on this was that they were able to figure out how policies and practices affected the students' world. So that was a nice connection to make. Go ahead, Grace, to the next one. Oops, I'm sorry, one more. So then the students would go through a little bit of a conservation story. We wanted to introduce some success stories so that students could see, yes, there are lots of challenges that are introduced to our habitats and our wildlife by human activities, but there are also ways that we have been successful at taking action in the past. And we wanted to share some examples of successful policies and also stakeholders working together. So for example, we have this story of the diamondback terrapin and the bycatch reduction devices that were introduced, and scientists, politicians, watermen working together to find a way to protect animals that are not crabs that might get stuck in crab pots. Go ahead, Grace, to the next one. So last spring, one of the ways that we adapted our programming was to create a action project choice board. So after students were starting to learn from home for the first time, we wanted them to have a chance to execute a version of the project that they had begun planning over the school year. So we gave them a couple of choices. The choices were based on what they had already decided on in class. So they maybe were interested in waste disposal. A lot of them were interested in invasive species. And then we also found a lot of interest in just habitat health. And so students could choose between those issues, and then among those issues, they could choose a strategy. So the first one was this household policy. Students would go through 3 steps. So the first would be that they would do an evaluation of their home, their neighborhood, their yard, whatever it might be. And in this case, the student chose waste disposal. They audited their home. Go ahead and hit the next one, Grace. And then they came up with a draft household policy based on what the data they collected at their home. And then the final step was, go ahead and hit one more time, was to have a final draft of that policy, and then all of the family members in the home would sign onto that policy. And if you hit it again, actually twice. So we found that the teachers enjoyed this because they found that their students were working with their family members and in actually engaging other people in the action that they were originally going to take with other classmates. And then the other thing that was really cool that came out of this is the story of a student who came up with this this household policy, but went above and beyond. So she says, I just wanted to share something about my waste disposal project. For an extra part that I didn't submit, I wrote an email to Chick-fil-A and talked about how if they could switch away from styrofoam cups, it would help the environment so much. And we went to Chick-fil-A and they have paper cups. So this is really exciting. And of course, for those of us in Maryland, we might know that there was a styrofoam ban that was implemented, and so Chick-fil-A was moving away from styrofoam. But this is really cool because the student says, well, maybe it was just to save money, but it makes me happy. I was thrilled to see it. And maybe I actually did something or made an impact. And so that kind of feeling that the student had, that she was either a part of something or she had an impact, that is what we want to pursue for our students taking action. Go ahead and hit the next one, Grace. So one of the other choices we gave to students last spring was that they could write a letter to someone who could make a difference. This example is of a student who chose to work on invasive species and invasive plants in particular. So they did a little neighborhood audit. Go ahead and hit the next one. You can hit the next one, Grace. Oh, perfect. Okay. And then they had a little draft letter that they could write. And then the student went ahead and wrote to the mayor of Salisbury a letter about invasive species and replacing invasive species on city grounds with native plants. So that was a nice thing to see. And we were starting to see some of that similar type of action be discussed as what students want to do this year. You can go ahead and hit another time. So this year we tried to make sure that as students were going through their student journals, their lesson plans, that they had multiple opportunities to consider policies and practices. So as they're brainstorming what kind of goal they're going to develop, they would think about, are there policies or practices that are helping or hurting the situation? Could a new rule or a policy help, or is there something that needs to be changed about an existing rule or policy? Go ahead, Grace, you can hit the next one. The students are then going through this process of thinking about strategies. And we really tried this year to open it up so that we weren't kind of providing as strict guardrails as we did last spring at the immediate, as they were immediately at home. But we still wanted to provide enough of a structure so that they could make choices that felt like possible for them. So they had these 3 different choices of strategies. The first one being help to make or change a policy or rule that can help with your wildlife, or in our high school students' case, it would be thinking more about habitat level. Go ahead, Grace, to the next one. And if they chose that, then they can figure out, okay, so here are some possible community leaders or policy makers. And the key to this strategy is talking to a community leader or policymaker. And then here are some possible ways you could do that in sort of this virtual situation that we're in. They could write an email, write a letter, do a video or a Zoom or a Google Meet, something that you have a chance to kind of connect directly with that person. You can go ahead to the next one. Our high school level, students have been engaging directly with stakeholders. And I do want to share that the way we've done this year, we would do it a little bit differently if we were in person. So in a normal year, we see our students, the students come out to our center for field experiences, and we also visit the classroom multiple times over the course of the school year. And so in a normal year, we would want the students to reach out to someone they didn't know. However, in this year, what we decided to do was to actually offer ourselves to be the stakeholders that the students would interview. So the students did start by thinking about who are all of the potential stakeholders that might be interested in supporting an action project in our county about the habitat that I'd like to protect. And then we came in as classroom visitors, as Zoom visitors to their classroom, and answered some questions. Grace, you can go to the next one. So first they're thinking about, this is again where they're thinking about all the different stakeholders, and then they have some tips. We use those fantastic Earth Force tip cards on how to have positive interactions with stakeholders. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second, and go to the next one, Grace. And then what the teachers did was they worked with their students in small groups. So if there were groups of students who all wanted to protect meadows, they would collaborate, even if they're going to actually carry out projects individually. But they would come up with questions that were relevant to the habitat that they were interested in. And one thing that we saw our teachers do this year, which is exciting, is they had their other classmates actually comment on the questions that they were planning. So to go back to this for just a second, when we first started introducing stakeholder outreach to our teachers and our students, we found that the teachers were coming to us and saying, the questions that our students are coming up with are pretty out there. They're not, they're maybe accusatory in some cases. So, you know, why haven't you fixed this big, huge environmental problem? Or they're not well thought out. And so one thing that we've seen sort of shift over the last year and a half is the teachers finding ways to guide their students into asking stronger questions. And then in this case, what we're seeing is the students are actually giving each other feedback and then going back and refining their own questions. So that's a nice development to observe. The teachers did send us these questions usually a day ahead of time. And just so we had a chance to kind of gather together any resources we wanted to make sure to send to our students or to share with them as we were meeting with them. And we found that the teachers and the students were very receptive. When we came to the classrooms, it drove a little bit of a higher engagement. I know the high school level, people are seeing a lot of blank screens and a lot of nobody talking during class. And this was pretty successful. We had students unmuting and asking questions. We had many students that would only do that maybe in the chat. But we did have some pretty good interaction through that, and the teachers really reflected. Grace, you can hit that next one. That this was a positive development, that they're seeing their students grow in the way they're thinking because of that stakeholder interaction. Go ahead and hit one more. Some of the teachers are then actually taking this a step further. So rather than leave it with just us, they have asked their students to go back and think about what is a different perspective. Who is somebody else you could talk to now that you've heard from one group or one person? Who's somebody else you could talk to about your habitat that you're interested in? So here's a student who's writing to the Maryland State Senator to ask about her role in protecting meadows, which is really, really cool to see. And you can go ahead and hit to the next one. So we're at a point this year where our students are not yet carried out action projects for the most part. So we're right at this point. So they have actually, our stakeholder visits were about 2 weeks ago, and we followed up with a second visit to their Zoom classroom to kind of be there as a support or answer questions as students were coming up with their timelines and thinking about how they're going to execute their strategies. So over the next couple of months, we'll start to see these action projects play out. So we're excited to see what's going to happen. I do want to share a couple of reflections that students have shared with us. This is a reflection from last spring. You can go ahead and hit that, Grace. So, you know, one of the things the student enjoyed the most, being able to reach out to someone who can actually help. It made me feel like my voice could potentially be heard. That was really fantastic. We also had some students, we do a pre and post reflection from students during the semesters. So our first semester students had a couple of reflections about the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. So Grace, if you could hit the next one. So we asked them, what interests you the most? And we asked this question before the beginning and at the end. And these are some at the end reflections. So the effects that a single action can have on the whole system. Go ahead, next one. There's so many things we can change in our everyday lives if we look from a different perspective. And I think there's one more. So interesting to learn how animals are adapting to changes, and it's so important to know this, so we should know what we should prioritize when it comes to environmental actions or issues, I'm sorry. So we're seeing some really positive results, and I would say just at a cursory look at the answers from the pre and the post, we haven't had time to totally analyze everything yet, but they're much more detailed in the post assessments as far as their interest in the Chesapeake Bay watershed and in understanding their role in taking action in the future. Go ahead and hit, I think I've got one more there. You can go through those. So the big conclusions, the things that we're learning, one is that stakeholder engagement piece takes practice and takes time to sort of figure out the best ways to support students as they engage in talking to people outside of their school, people outside of who they already know. And so that empathy mapping activity is one that I highly recommend, that really helps students to think about ideas from other points of view, and to think about other people who might be coming at this from a different perspective and putting themselves in those shoes. We also have really seen that this introducing places where students are making the choices to develop their own ideas everywhere along the way is what really drives that interest and that enthusiasm. So anywhere in your programming that you can make it the student's choice as to what happens next, that's going to be a benefit. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the teachers, we're really seeing these incredible things with the teacher groups that we're working with. And, you know, our teachers are thinking about how can we strengthen this programming by bringing in multidisciplinary themes. And so this is our high school group, who's actually right now in the middle of delivering a professional development that they are leading for American government teachers in their schools. And they're thinking about how can we overlap these themes of climate change and environmental science and climate policy in American government. So that's really exciting to see. Our middle school group is really thinking about how can the students grow from 6th grade, learning about ecosystems and understanding the food web, to thinking about human impacts, and to start like taking deeper action year after year. So they're thinking about how can they move this program so that students are engaged in action throughout their middle school career. So it's definitely an exciting experience to go through this. And yeah, that is it from me. Feel free to reach out with any questions. I'm always happy to share more resources or talk more about this.
Thank you so much, Mary Helen. That was awesome. What great examples of stakeholder engagement. And I love the highlights you did of how you took, when everything went south last year, how you took like the ideas of action projects and took them home. And some of those examples are so cool. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for really highlighting the stakeholder involvement, because that's such a key part of having successful action strategies and a really important civic action component. So there are a couple of questions. One is, Mary Helen, can you drop your email in the chat box? Yes. And then someone early on asked, what incentives do you offer teachers to participate, and that they find a struggle in creating real science opportunities for students is getting teachers buy-in amidst other demands. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's just such a great question. Certainly with both of the programs that I've highlighted today, these are grant-funded programs. So one of them is the BWET program, the Wacomico County 6th grade program. Our other program was funded by Chesapeake Bay Trust and Maryland DNR. And so certainly, you know, as far as like the after school time that it takes, or the summer time that it takes, the teachers do get a stipend. I would say that the engagement and the teachers actually are also growing in engagement as the program progresses. So, you know, I think most of the time we start with a fair amount of skepticism. And, you know, luckily we've had some really fantastic science supervisors who have been extremely supportive of these kinds of programs and have prioritized it for their teachers. But that said, you know, I think we all know teachers already have a million things to do. And certainly we don't want to ask them to do something that is adding to their stress or their burdens. One thing that has been exciting to see this year in particular is, especially with our high school group, they've been through this a few times, and they do feel like they're ready to train others. And the first session that they trained their their American government counterparts. You know, they're going through this where they're concerned about, or the government teachers are going to be like, oh gosh, what are we doing now? And so they're kind of, you know, they're gauging that a little bit. But they were doing, you know, they're putting together a program where they're going to explain what a MWEE is. And they're finding this quote online from Donna Volato from about MWEEs and about how these are not designed to be something extra. These are designed to really fit with your curriculum. And they put that quote up, and I said, okay, do you feel that way? I want to know. And they said, actually, yes, I really feel like these programs help us to get deeper into the curriculum that we want our students to get. Sort of sometimes feel like maybe some of the other stuff is extra, but that this is really not. So yeah, so it's a process for sure. But I think over time, as your teachers start to realize the experience that their students are getting out of it, that they start to feel like this is worth, you know, investing more of my time in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's a great response. And we do have a couple of other questions that we'll see if we can get to them at the end here, because we do need to move on. I think that was a great segue to the educator piece. So we do have a couple of educators here with us, and I'm going to let my colleague Justin Zacharin take it from here. I'm going to put a little note in the chat as we kind of transition. If anybody has some thoughts on this question, we'd love to hear. So thank you again, Mary Helen, and take it away, Justin.
Thanks, Alyssa, and thank you, Mary Helen. It's always a pleasure hearing EE providers have so much to offer teachers in the area. What you're doing is great work. Thank you. I'm here to introduce some teachers I've been working with for a few years now. My name is Justin Zacharin, Program Manager for Earth Force here in the Colorado area. I'm one of the lucky program managers for our organization that gets to reach out and work with teachers and their students. I oftentimes get introduced to new teachers who are looking to do something creative. They're looking to break out of the mold that they have been placed in through the curriculum, through the confines of school. A couple of such teachers are with us today, Jamie Breitner and Adam Knudsen. Jamie is a high school English teacher at Collegiate Academy of Colorado, and Adam Knudsen is a high school physical science teacher. I have to say, when they reached out to me, they were originally looking to build some kind of mountains to oceans expeditionary learning model for their school. Something they kind of said was more like a problem-based learning in nature kind of classroom. And I said, hey, hold on a second. Earth Force has a really great process for doing problem solving in communities. Maybe you can use this. And lo and behold, they've taken that and ran with it to the extent that they have essentially created a school-wide program and have turned on a lot of teachers that they work with to this opportunity. So without any further ado, I'm going to let the teachers talk. Jamie and Adam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Justin. So just a quick introduction to the two of us. So I'm Jamie Breitner, and I've been a teacher for 8 years. I have a master's degree in education, and just started working with Adam on this program. So
Hi, I'm Adam Knudsen. I've been in education, I think, for total, I guess, around 20 years now, that I think about it. And also, like on the side, a lot of the things, like passions I have are a lot of ocean science as well. So I've got a little bit of background in that. But yeah, that's kind of the start of our interest of wanting to do kind of a mountains to oceans and where it's kind of gone from here. So let me keep talking.
Yeah, do you want to tell them a little bit about our program?
So really quick, so we found that, you know, when we're hired to be problem-based learning school, and when we started taking that on, we weren't exactly sure, you know, how to do that, but we both have a huge passion and interest wanting to break the mold. Hopefully a lot of you teachers are in that same position there. And we really wanted to get our kids outside. We're both outdoor nuts. And so we just started honing in on our local state park, which is really close. And so hopefully this is a resource that's available to all you potential teachers out there as well. But this effectively became our outdoor classroom where we did all these activities. And, you know, in many cases, we were trying to find something that would, you know, we could pull from science here and there, but how do we pull from, you know, the insights from English and all that? And that's, of course, you know, it made it, Justin and the Earth Force process made it a lot easier for us to kind of build some of the framework and some of the activities that we do here at Chatfield.
Next slide.
This is where we meet. So this was back in September of this year. So we were fortunate enough to actually operate during COVID times, during outdoor ed. And it was probably one of the only functional things that might have been happening if in most of the state. So, but it was an outdoor adventure, and those things were way more promoted and considered to be safer than some of the other activities, you know. So we conducted science activities, and we've been able to do this pretty much the frequency of at least once a month, pretty much. And so what's cool about this is we get to see the seasons, of course, and how it changes. So, and every state park has a wealth of resources that you can use to provide, you know, kind of shelter and some security for kids as well. And we also found that within our local Audubon, which is located there as well. And so if you guys have any kind of nature center or education facility like Audubon as well, that's a super win right there, because then you're tapping into even more experts in science, you know. So yeah, is there anything you want to add to that one?
I don't think so. I guess just that our Denver Audubon is part of Chatfield State Park, and it's located about 10 minutes from our school. So it's pretty easy to do transportation there on our monthly trips. Usually the parents just drop their kids off at the state park instead of at school. Next slide.
So just us getting kids out in nature, it turns into that MWEE experience, and you know, and having the connections that we had made over there, and basically for us to exist there required that we made connections with people and stakeholders. And, you know, we just started asking, what can we do and how can we be involved in it? It got us into projects that we would never thought that we, you know, could ever be a part of. And so like right now we have kids on one day helping set up a birdhouse, you know. And like I said, some of the coolest things is being able to go there year round and see how the environment changes over the course of a year. And you get really in cue with the phenology that happens in a region like that. So.
Next slide.
Okay, so the Earth Force process, which some of you guys are maybe getting acquainted to, really, as far as getting on board with a lot of science topics, the inventory process is really just immersing the kids in what's interesting and checking out the area, but it lends itself to some great science opportunities. So one of the two big ones that I can think of are essentially a macro invertebrate study. So on one slide, you see kids there kind of going through and they're looking for all the bugs in the water, which is an indicator of water quality. And they also do test kits with chemistry as well. So we definitely hit on some science components while we're doing that. And then that even extends over into Watershed, which you see. And every time you go out into the water, especially if you look at some of the Earth Force processes for inventory, there's a lot of science gathering to have there. And that usually always connects to Watershed. So, anything good? Okay. So one of the biggest things that I had mentioned too is when you go, especially into a state park, there's so many permission sets that you have to have in order for you to exist there. And those people are wanting you to be there. It's just they want you to establish a connection. And then these people become the ambassadors of the area. And you just end up learning who these people are just out of engagement. And we've been fortunate enough that out of our time working at Chatfield State Park, we've been introduced to a wealth of professionals, experts, and people that work in politics, and also people that just help maintain the trails in the park and all that, and all of which have a say in the whole thing. And they've worked with kids, and it's been really groovy. There's been a lot of choose your own opportunities that are choose your own adventures that has kind of come out of this that we wouldn't have expected to happen. And so learning stakeholders is a cool process there. So
The woman on the left on that slide is from Denver Water, and then on the right is a state park park technician. So yeah, we work closely with all the stakeholders.
So, you know, the process, the Earth Force process, when you get kids out in nature and they're doing the inventory, which is really just, you know, actively involving, you know, having fun and doing science, things like that, eventually you start finding issues that plague an area. And usually that's when you can kind of start driving kids to work on that social change. And so we decide on several issues, and we have to narrow it down through some criteria, which I guess we'll come to in a bit. But there's definitely opportunities for democratic decision making. And in this case, this happens to be a clip right before we did a big vote of what issue we were going to solve as a class for that particular year. So.
And to kind of tie that back to like, why would teachers want to do this, and why would students want to do this? The giving students choice is a big part of it, and then having them just fall in love with the space is also another big part of it. So when we go to the location, a lot of those first few trips are just having them fall in love with that nature space.
Focus on fun.
Yes.
Focus on fun. Yeah.
Because, you know, if you get too focused on like having all of these perfect lessons and, you know, making it like school but outside, then they're not going to be as committed and as engaged as if they already love the space, and then they're like, okay, how can we make this space even better? Next.
Okay. And so we go through this process that Earth Force does, and some of the coolest parts is we decide on it, and then we come up with a battle plan, and then we execute. And the execute part is actually pretty cool. And for us, in our situation, we asked to have back-to-back days, and where we would show up and be there all day, and we did a bunch of trail restoration, and we were all tired at the end of it, but it was definitely, you know, for our group in this particular picture, it was a day that we just kind of earned out there. And it was, you know, from the actions that the kids wanted, and, you know, this is like what they wanted to solve, and they asked for all the, you know, question sets, and we helped them kind of get through it all, and this is what they voted on for, and this is what we helped them accomplish. And I just, when I see the action component of it, which is so important, I would almost say that speaks louder than any grade I think I have given the student. You know, so it's just actually having something that they can show, and, you know, it's tangible, I guess. So.
Okay, so actually, I think that was just kind of our quick overview of the process at our school. So, you know, very student-led, and then the students end up deciding on a strategy to implement a solution. So now we kind of wanted to dive into some of the specifics of different parts of the process. So one of the things that we wanted to talk to you about was the civic engagement component of the project. So there's a lot of civic components to it. The one that's on the screen right now is just democratic decision making, and, you know, empowering students to do that themselves. And so we came up with this structure for a regular meeting that we have with the students that just keeps them focused on the goals of the project, where they are in the process, puts the responsibility of leading the meetings on the students, and yeah, just generally helps keep our meetings organized. This also works in a distance learning environment, so you can do your meetings on Google Meets or Zoom or whatever you're using. Assigning roles, like in step 4, is really useful so that all the kids know what their contribution to the team is during each meeting. So we have these like along the way throughout the process. And so let's say we're in like the issue selection part. We've tried doing like longer, big presentations where the kids are talking a lot about their issues. And we found that really it's more effective if we can get them to just give between 1 and 3 sentences in the meeting, because otherwise, you know, they just tune out. They're high school kids, and their attention span isn't that long. So giving them just a short thing that they need to contribute to the meeting. First of all, it puts individual responsibility on each student. You have to come to your meeting prepared to give 1 to 3 sentences. It's achievable, and it helps contribute to the solution without taking forever. So yeah, this is just a handy structure for the meeting. We also use a program called Trello to keep track of all of our research. That's Trello, Trello.com. And so we put all of the information into, into the Trello, and then also talk about it at our meetings. And so another thing that we have in the Trello is a list of all the steps of the Earth Force process, because it can be easy for the students to get bogged down with like the big picture. You know, normally they're used to an education system where it's like, here's your little assignment, and here's, you know, you complete that, and then we move on to the next assignment. Whereas this is a much more complicated process that we're trying to empower them to take part in. And so having the steps of the Earth Force process that we refer back to consistently, I think, do you have the next slide in there? Yeah, so like at this point we were on step 3. So one of the first steps in our meeting is like, all right, we're in step 3. What are we doing in step 3? And so then it just kind of focuses the brain on what is this chunk of the process and what are the steps that we need to do to accomplish this step, to break it down for them more. So we review where we are in the process, and then we get into contributing new information, all that kind of stuff in our regular meetings. Other components of the civic engagement piece include navigating multiple perspectives. So this is part of step 3. Do you want to talk about multiple perspectives?
Well, okay, so just really quick, multiple perspectives. The highlights that we had in here is you're going to find individuals in this process that we had no idea we'd end up getting involved in. But for instance, at our local location, there are individuals, well, there's a Lockheed Martin is right up the hill. And so we would have some issues where we found out that there was some polluting. And of course that would, you know, rub some of the officials that would work over at Audubon and Chatfield maybe the wrong way. And we even had parents that would be working at Lockheed. And so that also related to an issue that we ended up finding where we had one individual at Lockheed Martin specifically that was found to be polluting a bunch of cigarette butts in an environmental area. And so it just, those were one of those things where you find stakeholders or people that are involved, that there are kind of social conflicts that could potentially happen. And so navigating those different perspectives, I mean, that's real. I mean, these are real human beings behind the stories here and all the things that you interact with. And that's what's actually kind of cool about the process. You'll kind of find all these little dramas, I guess, that are kind of that are happening, you know, when you go to really solve issues. And it's really just because there's some people, you know, that are behind the scenes doing some of this stuff. And, you know, you're going to find that you will have to teach children how to address those things appropriately and professionally and with empathy, but especially when it comes to things where people can kind of butt heads. And so I just remember specifically having issues about hearing, you know, pollution from Lockheed and then it relating to stuff that was going on at the Audubon. It was definitely starting to bump heads a little bit. So just be prepared for those kinds of things. So
just one other, I know we're almost out of time, so one other quick example of the civic engagement component is, and Mary Helen already talked about it a little bit, but having students engage with politicians. So we've had students email politicians. There was a congresswoman who had a little dialogue going with students. And to facilitate that, we would compose the emails together in class, and then the students would send it. And then you have to remind them to check their email because they don't have that habit ready yet. But there was a class that one year they did they were trying to create a petition to basically help with plastic issues. And so there was a ton of civic engagement there. They had to look up how to do a petition, what the requirements of the petitions were, you know, the formatting of the petitions and all that stuff, and write it up. Tons of ELA skills in there. So yeah, the link in the chat of the petition was written by students, and it would have gone down without a hitch if we hadn't been hit with COVID, and so then we couldn't get the signatures, unfortunately. But we were able to accomplish other parts of that project, even through COVID. So other than that, there's a link that's going to go into the chat of just the folder of our favorite Earth Force resources that we come back to year after year. If there's time, we can kind of go through those. If not, they're labeled. So
they're really good. I think they're easy for, especially like whiteboard discussions and things like that, or Google Jamboard, and they're good for discussing things in online remote situations. So is what we kind of found so far with those. So
yeah, they're really flexible. So you don't have to just hand out the worksheet as it is. You can turn it into a Jamboard or turn it into a whiteboard thing.